you throw things. When you throw things, people think you have anger issues. When people think you have anger issues, your schedule clears up, etc. When your schedule clears up, you grow a scraggly beard. When you grow a scraggly beard, you start taking in stray animals. And when you start taking in stray animals, you can't stop taking in stray animals. Don't pay too much for cable. I have my own version today. Though you feel perfectly well, your doctor insists you have a checkup. When your doctor gives you a checkup, he insists you have a flu shot and a tetanus booster. When you have a flu shot and a tetanus booster, you wake up the next day feeling you've been beaten by a gorilla with a baseball bat. When you feel you've been beaten by a gorilla with a baseball bat, you wander out into the street and get hit by a truck. Don't get a checkup when you feel perfectly well. Right. I haven't yet wandered out into the street and gotten hit by a truck. If I seem to be heading that way, please stop me. So, today's event. There's been a battle going on for some time now in dueling books and sharp exchanges out there on the internet and the blogosphere over whether or not one side of the political spectrum is particularly more anti-scientific than the other. A leading advocate for the conservatives are anti-science is a fellow named Christopher Mooney, who wrote The Republican War on Science. Mooney's argued that so many Republicans hold heterodox views on evolution and climate change as to make the entire political philosophy anti-science and anti-scientific. Others, including myself and Alex, this is how we actually met, have pointed out the situation is far from clear, as progressives have a whole host of positions that can be described as anti-science, from their scaremongering over genetically modified foods to their embrace of things such as the linear no-dose, linear no-threshold model of toxicity, to the fixation on organic agriculture and tolerance of the anti-vaccine movement, although I'm having second thoughts about that. There's a whole host of issues, however, on which the left is as anti-science as you can imagine. Some environmental journalists are beginning to catch on to this, and I would point you to the work of Keith Kluwer, who's got a blog called Kaleidoscape, who has been steadily moving toward a position of saying, let's call it the way it is. Both sides have their issues and have problems. The left's particular fixation on genetically modified foods, of course, is killing many, many, many people. But until now, the sort of response to Mooney has been somewhat scattershot, with just blog hits and articles and things like that, until now. Because now Alex Berezow, how do you pronounce that? Berezow. And editor of Real Clear Science, and his co-author Hank Campbell, founder of Science 2.0, a online science communication community, have brought together the various strands of anti-science in the progressive part of the political spectrum. And they actually do something I really respect, which is they start the book by defining what progressives are. As a scientist myself, it's really refreshing when somebody starts an actual book by saying, okay, let's talk about the definitions of things so we know what we're talking about. Alex's background is in microbiome. His doctorate's in microbiology, which mine was, I had some molecular biology for my master's. But it's clear that his scientific education did not go in vain. It was not in vain. When I got my copy of Science Left Behind, I went to the chapter that I would be able to judge best on energy and environment, or Chapter 5, Crappy Conservation and Clean Energy Chaos. I happen to love alliteration myself, so I got a freebie in that title. And I was pleased to see that they take on some of the crazier aspects of energy and environmental policy favored by progressives, from the low-flow toilets that don't work to shower heads that hiss at you really than get you clean. They point out some very, very good points about water conservation, where if you really were worried about water conservation, you wouldn't be looking at shower heads and toilets, because most of the water use is industrial for energy use, irrigation, and so forth. In fact, you have to get all the way down to 1% level when you're talking about consumer use of water, that you would then be trying to knock that down by 0.1% or so by going to smaller toilets and hissing showers. So I'm hoping that one of the things they also discuss is one of my pet peeves, which is the willingness of progressives to sacrifice the environment for their pet projects. First, and this is actually what got me into public policy. When I was a kid, I was raised by my mother, who was a bit crazy. She was a treasure hunter, actually. She loved to go prospecting for gold and metal detecting for coins and things like that. So I spent many summers out in the Mojave Desert, where we had a mining claim. And she said she would tell people we'd go digging for gold, and what she meant was I would go digging for gold, and she would go panning for gold, which was once I had done all the digging. But what we were active with believe it or not, most people don't know this, there are actually prospecting groups, whole national groups of prospectors and so forth. And we were involved with one in California. And even then, this was 1973, perhaps, 74, the environmentalists were trying to get the Mining Act revised to stop the ownership of mining claims in the Mojave Desert because of the kangaroo rat that was endangered and the desert tortoise were endangered. And that was my introduction to the tension between mixed use and non-use. The environmentalists were simply adamant that they were going to wall off the entire Mojave Desert for use. And they did. In fact, it became impossible to use recreational vehicles and to go out and maintain mining claims became more and more onerous, and so we wound up giving ours up. Now, of course, when they want to put solar installations out there, the environmentalists say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea, and they talk about things like gentle mowing of the tops of the cacti that take 100 years to grow back. They relocate a bunch of tortoises, even though the mortality rate when they move them is ridiculously high, and of course, if you did it maliciously, you'd be in jail. And apparently, kangaroo rats no longer matter because they want their solar fields. So, and the same is true where, since they happen to notice that people don't live out in the Mojave Desert, so it's okay to run the power lines through state parks to get them to the cities, whereas before this, of course, you couldn't even look at a state park with an idea of running power lines through it. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Alex, who will step us through the feel-good fallacies and the rise of the anti-scientific left. We'll have time for Q&A afterward because I'm going to reach behind Alex and pop him with the book if he runs too late. But with that, over to you, and thank you all for joining us. Alex?
Thank you for that very kind introduction. So, our book is Science Left Behind, and it's about the rise of the anti-scientific left. In fact, we call it Feel-Good Fallacies and the Rise of the Anti-Scientific Left. And as Ken said, my name's Alex, and I've got my PhD in microbiology from the University of Washington, and more importantly, now I'm the editor of RealClearScience.com. So just a little bit about me. My background is entirely microbiology. In fact, that's me. A friend of mine who became an OBGYN said I look like an uber geek in that picture, so I thought I'd put it up there. That's me working in an anaerobic chamber, which you may have come across at one point. We grew all sorts of extremely smelly bacteria in that thing. I went to the University of Washington in 2004, and I got my PhD in 2010, and then I immediately became editor of Real Clear Science. So I've been in the real world for 2 years. So my personal science philosophy is rather straightforward and simple. If you're not an expert, it is best to accept what is considered mainstream science. Science should always come before politics, and that means ideology or political parties are not beyond criticism. So in my view here, that I play for Team Science. I don't come to a talk playing for Team Red or for Team Blue. I play for Team Science. And I think that we should always try to purge anti-scientific thinking, even if it comes from our friends and from our political allies. So then why science left behind? Why pick on the left? Well, the media is very quick to cover anti-scientific beliefs from conservatives, in particular global warming, in particular evolution. Todd Aiken, for instance, made some rather unenlightening comments about pregnancy. And for days, this was a front-page story about how he doesn't understand reproductive biology. However, when someone on the far left does something, when President Barack Obama says that vaccines might cause autism, that was ignored. And yes, he did say that. We'll talk about that later in the talk. So also, there have already been several books published on the topic. Chris Mooney's one of them. There's a couple other books. So if you want to find out how the right is bad at science, there's already a big market for that. To our knowledge, this is the first book on the anti-scientific left. So progressives are anti-science as well.
Let's give the devil his due. Bob Zubrin wrote a book recently called Merchants of Despair that is similar, but within months of yours at the same time.
Oh, okay. And progressives are anti-science as well. It's just it's not reported by the media. The media simply looks the other way when their political allies do things that are anti-science. So who are the progressives? What do we mean by progressives? Well, we took David Nolan's chart here and we kind of relabeled it to fit more of our political ideology today. Conservatives and libertarians are probably the easiest to identify. The conservatives are the mainstream Republican Party. Libertarians need no introduction, I think. The Ron Paul Revolution, bring us back the Constitution. The left, however, though, is a little bit trickier to define because I see them as splitting into liberals and liberals and progressives. Liberals being more like the Tony Blair, the Bill Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, pro-business, but they do tend to favor economic outcomes. So they want to control economic outcomes. That's their main focus. Think of unionized police officers, unionized teachers. Progressives are an entirely different beast. These are the people who, the typical tree-hugging San Francisco liberals, that's progressives. That's who we're talking about. These are the people who are interested in not just economic outcomes, but also social outcomes. So whereas conservatives are interested in talking about drugs and sex, progressives are interested in talking about whether or not you can put salt on your French fries and whether or not you can have a plastic bag or drink a soda. Michael Bloomberg, great example of a progressive. He's banning cups in New York City. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that ideology of the left, the progressive ideology. So what are some myths that are commonly held by today's progressives? Well, we got about 5 myths, but we tend to focus on the first 2 because those are where the big juicy ideas, the bad ideas are actually. 1 is that natural things are good. 2, unnatural things are bad. 3, unchecked science will destroy us. 4, science is only relative anyway. And 5, science is on our side. Okay. The first one, we actually won't have much time to get into these myths. If you want to get in my book, you'll learn all about them there. We're going to talk mostly about the most famous progressive today, President Barack Obama, and his resume when it comes to science. But just to give you an idea of why these myths are important. Natural things are good. That's behind the organic food movement. That's behind the rejection of genetically modified food. Unnatural things are bad. That's the fear of chemicals, the fear of BPA, the fear of chemistry, things that are unnatural, the fear of pesticides, fertilizers. Unchecked science will destroy us. That's the fear of nuclear power. How can we let people build nuclear power plants? They're going to kill everybody. Science is only relative anyway. Well, what do scientists know? There's always some other scientist who disagrees. And 5, science, of course, being on our side, was we just already talked about at length. Progressives believe that science is on their side. So what are the results of these myths? Well, protests, and lots of protests. Just to give you some idea of the topics that we cover in our book, the top left we have CDC, stop lying, flu shots are toxic. I know Ken might agree they actually are toxic now after his experience. But so we have a protester here saying that vaccines are toxic, and the Centers for Disease Control, the most respected microbiological organization in the world, is lying to you about vaccines. On the right, upper right, we have a big baby bottle. That's the BPA movement. Don't give your babies milk from baby bottles because they'll all die from the plastic that the baby bottle is made from. And then the bottom, this is actually what we wanted to put on the cover of our book. This is the anti-genetic modification movement. These are the demon corn, because corn is genetically modified to have a toxin in it which kills insects, so they don't like that. We told our publisher this is the picture we want for our book, and they said, "You're crazy. We're not putting that on the cover of the book." So unfortunately, there you go. That's the book cover we wanted. Also, basic scientific research has been opposed by members of the progressive left. The upper left corner, don't test on my friends. They're opposed to all animal research. Now keep in mind, this isn't just chimpanzee research, which we probably shouldn't be doing, or primate research, like big primates, like gorillas. They're opposed to almost all animal research. No mice, no rats. Pretty much all of our medical research comes from mice and rats, and actually some of the smaller primates like rhesus monkeys, macaques. Upper right corner, there's a sign in a yard that says, "Stop bothering us. We support science." You may not be able to see what happened. This is in Los Angeles. There was a neighborhood of scientists that lived in an area, and protesters would not protest at the university. They would find out where the researchers lived and would protest outside their house. And this, of course, is frightening for scientists. In fact, when I was at the University of Washington, we would get emails once a year saying that the animal rights protesters were back. Be careful, don't engage with them, okay? Because they have a history of violence. They have a history of intimidating researchers. And just to give you an idea of how loony these people are. So one of these neighbors puts up a sign, says, "Stop bothering us, we support science." He was in support of his neighbor. One of the animal researchers crossed off science and said, "Torture, we support torture." That is how they view people like me and Ken. We're torturers. We're not helping people, we're not helping medical science, we're animal torturers. But the bottom right, Lawrence Summers, who was fired from Harvard, essentially, he was pushed out the door, for making the radical claim that men and women might be different. He essentially put forward a very controversial but biologically plausible idea that there is a genetic basis to intelligence and that maybe men and women are different when it comes to intelligence. Yes, it's edgy. Yes, it's controversial. There is some scientific evidence to support what he says. There's some scientific evidence which does not support what he says. The point is that it's biologically plausible. It's a worthwhile discussion to have as a geneticist and as a biologist. He was essentially fired for that, president of Harvard. And in the lower left corner is a member of Greenpeace engaging in an act of eco-terrorism. In Australia, they were testing a field of genetically modified crops, and they said it was toxic, so they came in and they took a weed whacker and mowed down the entire field. And then they complained that there isn't enough testing for GM crops.
They did the same, environmentalists did the same thing with a tree farm that was being used to test for the sequestration of greenhouse gases. They were looking to see if they could increase the absorption of greenhouse gases with breeding of the plants, and the environmentalists didn't like that, so they burned down the grove.
And so this is obviously a big problem for progressives because science now could actually maybe help solve global warming with genetic modification. But they're so ideologically opposed to genetically modified anything that they're willing to engage in essentially acts of eco-terrorism. And then energy production. As you know, the far left seems to be opposed to any and all forms of energy, period. In the upper left corner, after Fukushima, you had people protesting nuclear power. You had Angela Merkel, who I actually respect immensely as the new Iron Chancellor of Germany. She decided, because of the protests, to shut down nuclear power. Now, she's a nuclear physicist, okay, so she really should know better.
Germany hasn't had an earthquake in...
or a tidal wave in a long time. But she gave in to environmentalist pressure and decided to shut down nuclear power plants. In the upper right corner, you have fracking causes cancer, which is not true. And you have some guy dressed as a weasel dancing. Not sure what that's about. In the lower left corner, you have ya no represas, which is no dams. They don't want hydroelectric power. This is in the region Patagonia in the Argentinian-Chilean border. So they're opposed to hydroelectric power. And then the bottom right, you have some guy who's opposed to wind power. And you may not be able to read this, but it's classic. It says, "No industrial wind, capitalism still blows." So I'm not sure what that has to do with capitalism, but he made sure he fit it in.
It's the weasel.
Sure.
That might actually turn it off.
Okay.
Yeah, we probably can't do that, I'm afraid.
Sorry. So let's review just for a second. Progressive protesters don't want vaccines, chemicals, genetically modified crops, research into genetically modified crops, animal research, gender-based biology research, nuclear power, fracking, natural gas, wind power, hydroelectric power. Can someone actually believe all of that, yet still be considered pro-science? How exactly do progressives think of scientists? Probably like this: crazy people who are out to destroy the planet. So, I know this crowd won't object, but usually when I was giving a talk in Seattle, which they're not conservative in Seattle, they would say something to the point of, progressive activists, of course, are silly. It's the progressive politicians who are driving the real conversation. They're the real pro-science people. Okay, really? Well, let's look. President Barack Obama, the #1 progressive politician in America, he says in his inaugural address, January 20th, 2009, "We'll restore science to its rightful place." That's a lofty goal for a politician. How did he do? On the subject of embryonic stem cells, You might remember when George W. Bush banned embryonic stem cells. Well, he didn't. He never banned it. That was we'll be generous and say, misinformation perpetuated by the media. He never banned embryonic stem cells. He did limit federal funding to pre-existing cell lines, and about 21 embryonic stem cell lines were available as of 2001. Obama promised to fix this, and so he issued an executive order on March 9th of 2009. What did that do? It lifted the ban, the quote-unquote ban, on federal funding. So today, as of the time I put this talk together about a month ago, there are 178 embryonic stem cell lines available for federal funding, but there are 760 lines available globally. So he increased it from about 21 lines to 178 lines. Most notably, they must be derived, these embryonic stem cells must be derived from leftover in vitro fertilization embryos, and permission is required from parents. That has the effect of really limiting the number of embryonic stem cells that you can get, okay? So the idea that he blew the doors open on embryonic stem cell research is a fiction. He did not. George Bush nudged the door open to embryonic stem cell research, and Barack Obama nudged it slightly further. He did not blow the doors off this research. And here's an ethical issue, and I think this is a worthwhile issue that no one really knows about, but it's a worthwhile issue to discuss. His policy does little to nothing to address the hundreds of thousands of embryos that are sitting in freezers all over the country right now, that no one wants, essentially, and they're just sitting in freezers. The reason that happens is because people who go in who have in vitro fertilization, they will usually make 6 or 7 embryos, and then they will implant 2 or 3 into the woman, hopefully that one of them will take, then they'll have a baby. The other remaining 3 or 4, they put them in a freezer indefinitely, and they're just sitting there. They've been sitting there for decades in some cases. So his policy really does nothing to address hundreds of thousands of these samples sitting in freezers all over the country. So what is still not eligible for federal funding? Well, the creation of embryos only for research purposes is not allowed. So we can create embryos for in vitro fertilization, and then if you ask parents, can we use your extra embryos for research, that is allowed. But you cannot create an embryo specifically for research purposes. That is not allowed. Bizarrely, the derivation of human embryonic stem cells from somatic cell nuclear transfer is not allowed. That is a technology that was used to clone Dolly the sheep. Now we're allowed to do animal research, but you're not allowed to use this technique for humans.
One quick translation, somatic cells are skin cells.
Yes. Skin cells or liver cells, brain cells, it's anything other than the sexual cells. What this technology does is if you can take a nucleus out of a body cell, so let's say I take a nucleus out of one of my skin cells, you could then take that and put it into an egg cell, a human egg cell, or another embryonic stem cell, and you can shock that, and hopefully, if everything works right, you can then create a clone of cells that is basically just my DNA. Now, the scary part of the technology is, well, will we be cloning people in the future? And that is banned, okay? We have banned, I think that's probably a good idea to ban that. What we do need, however, is this technology for cloning organs. So if you want to clone a new heart, clone a new liver, this technique is almost certainly going to be necessarily tool in our tool belt to do this. That is still not allowed, cannot get federal funding for that research either. And then the injection of embryonic stem cells into non-human primates is also not allowed, but that sounds like a pretty decent idea at this point. The point is there are many bioethical issues here that I think need to be very seriously discussed. And we haven't discussed them in 3 years because President Obama fixed the problem and it's all solved. And really, he did nothing of the sort. He just inched the door open a little bit more than what George Bush had done. Barack Obama on vaccines, unfortunately, didn't do a lot better. When he was running for office in 2008, here's a quote, direct quote from him. "We've just seen a skyrocketing autism rate. Some people are suspicious that it's connected to the vaccines, this person included. The science right now is inconclusive, but we have to research it." That was in 2008. This is wrong on so many levels that it's hard really to unpack how wrong this is. First of all, the medical community has never accepted this link, ever. This was only something that made the political rounds and has made its way into mainstream culture. Medical doctors and medical scientists do not support a link between vaccines and autism. Also, the science was quote-unquote settled as early as 2002. It was suspected that the scientist, who is pictured there, Andrew Wakefield, it was suspected that his research was wrong as early as 2002. In 2011, he was just called an outright fraud by the British Medical Journal. However, in 2008, 6 years after a landmark study in 2002 conclusively demonstrated that there is no link between vaccines and autism, here's Barack Obama pandering to an anti-vaccine crowd. Did things improve when he took the White House? Well, in 2009, you might remember the H1N1 influenza pandemic, where we were all frightened that we were all going to get flu and die. And there was a vaccine shortage in the United States. In fact, I remember this quite well because I was encouraging all my friends to go get their vaccines, and my parents and everybody I knew. Microbiologists are very scared of influenza, and rightfully so. About every 40 years or so, we have a major pandemic, and sometimes they're very deadly. We're overdue for one of these pandemics, and so this is not fear-mongering. I'm not a fear-mongering kind of guy, but influenza is something that keeps microbiologists up at night. So why was there a vaccine shortage in 2009? Well, an overly cautious FDA did not allow two things. Now, this occurred under the Obama administration. The first things that they did not allow were adjuvants. An adjuvant is something that extends the vaccine supply. So it stimulates the immune response. So you don't need as much vaccine if you add an adjuvant. This is not a controversial technology. It's used in Europe, okay? If it's used in Europe, it's not a controversial technology. That was not allowed. Secondly, at last minute, they ordered a switch from multi-dose to single-dose vials. Why? The reason is because single-dose vials have less thimerosal than multi-dose vials. Thimerosal is the chemical, which contains a little bit of mercury, that the anti-vaccine crowd says this causes autism. Okay. In 2009, this had been thoroughly debunked for years, and yet Obama's FDA gave in to that. And partially as a result, we had a vaccine shortage. What was the outcome of the 2009 H1N1 influenza? Well, 61 million Americans ended up becoming infected, 274,000 hospitalizations, and 12,470 deaths. Now, I'm not a person who says Barack Obama killed all those people. I don't believe that, okay? I don't believe the FDA killed all those people. But I do believe that our bad policies contributed to this outcome. And how many of these illnesses and deaths, and think of the money involved, the billions of dollars in healthcare costs that we just wasted simply because we weren't prepared in 2009 to deal with the H1N1 influenza pandemic. Before we go back to more Barack Obama, let's stop and recall President George W. Bush, who was regularly accused of manipulating scientific data, often by Barack Obama himself. Promoting science is about ensuring that scientific data is never distorted or concealed to serve a political agenda, and that we make scientific decisions based on facts, not ideology. President Barack Obama, March 9th, 2009. Well, did he live up to that? The BP oil spill was one of the biggest global oil spills in world history. How did the Obama administration respond to this tragedy? Quoting from the Los Angeles Times, taken together, two of the reports paint a picture of a government that was as unprepared to deal with a catastrophic spill as BP, and the portrait of an administration that, listen to this, withheld information from the public, and more specifically scientists, about how much oil was getting into the water, how much remained, and how such estimates were calculated appeared to contradict Obama's pledge to make government more transparent and trustworthy. So his very promise that he will be better and more trustworthy and relying on facts and not ideology and not hiding things from scientists was violated not even 2 years into his presidency during one of the biggest environmental catastrophes our nation has ever seen. On the environment, Barack Obama has a mixed record, and I'm not sure if all of you are going to agree with my positions on some of these issues, but I know that you guys are a great crowd, and I know you're not going to agree with me 100%. The good is that he eliminated the corn ethanol subsidy, which I think everyone here would agree with. First of all, the corn ethanol subsidy is a waste of money. Secondly, it produces nitrous oxide, which is horrible for the environment. It's compared to carbon dioxide, it has a global warming potential that is 300 times greater than carbon dioxide. So when you're making biofuels, let's just say this. The Economist ran an article called Biofuels, okay? That's their opinion on biofuels. They think it's a horrible idea. He did put in new limits on carbon emissions from coal power plants. I support that because I think we should transition to natural gas, because coal is very bad for the environment. Not only are you burning and releasing carbon, there's also a lot of heavy metal toxins. They have whole lakes which they set aside just to dump waste into. Like, it's a nasty process. And if we can get into natural gas, that's a win for everybody, especially since it's cheap. Okay, that's where Barack Obama's good policy on the environment ends. The bad was he has still to this day no comprehensive climate change legislation. He spent all of his time doing Obamacare. And in addition, because he wanted to do cap and trade, which I'm not in favor personally of cap and trade. I think a carbon tax might be a better policy. But cap and trade is not something that I think is a good idea. That was the main thrust of their climate change legislation that barely passed the House, 219 to 212. It was so unpopular in the Senate that they didn't even take it up, okay? Joe Manchin, he's a senator from West Virginia, very famously took the cap and trade bill and tacked it to a tree, and he's a Democrat, and he shot it with a rifle. And so that pretty much killed the legislation. I mean, he literally killed the legislation. So that's why that didn't go on in the Senate. Also, even though we have now let the ethanol subsidy for corn expire, we have not waived the ethanol mandate for fuel. So still, your gasoline has to have 15% ethanol blended into it. That is a horrible idea. It's a horrible policy. The reason is because there's people on the other side of the world right now who don't have food. And when we're diverting our corn to make gas for our cars, people on the other side of the world starve. So it's not a good policy at all, and we should end the ethanol mandate, at least waive it for this year, for at the very least. Now the ugly. Cash for clunkers. Clunkernomics. New cars under this program. So obviously, if you're going to trade in your old car and get a new car, it's going to have better gas mileage simply because technology is increasing. An analysis showed that if clunkernomics had not existed, the new cars would have only been 0.23 miles per gallon less efficient. So that was the overall efficiency increase, was 0.23 miles per gallon. It saved the U.S., it's estimated, 12,000 barrels of oil per day, but we use 9 million barrels of oil per day. So this is a literal drop in the bucket. There was a short-term boost in car sales, followed by a quick drop-off, no long-term increase in car sales, and the cost to the taxpayer was $24,000 per car. I'm not an economist, but that sounds like a really expensive car.
Adding insult to injury, it brought up the price of used cars, which meant that people with older cars held on to them longer and probably eradicated whatever benefit there was with increased emissions from older cars.
And that's the other thing. There are carbon emissions to building new cars, right? And we took old cars and smashed them. And then Barack Obama also ignored, we also know that one of the common complaints was that George Bush consistently put the motives of industry above the motives of the EPA because he was big oil and big business and you know the rigmarole. Barack Obama did the exact same thing. The EPA said we need to decrease smog levels because smog is killing people. And Barack Obama said no, because it's not good for business. So he did exactly what he accused George Bush of doing all throughout his campaign. On the issue of nuclear waste, I'm going to probably try to get through these next couple of slides here quickly because I've got some really juicy stories from the left coast that I have to get for you. Barack Obama is not realistically dealing with nuclear power. This has been a political football for years, ever since the Reagan administration. He didn't want the nuclear waste plant built out in the east. Tom Foley didn't want it built in the west. Some Texas congressman didn't want it in his state. So that's how Nevada got stuck with it. It's been studied, however, this land, Yucca Mountain's been studied for about 25 years, and the facility is already built, and it costs about $13.5 billion. It is safer to store nuclear waste in one central location in the middle of nowhere, apologies to Nevada, than to scatter it around the country, which is what our current policy is. Our current policy is when the nuclear power plant is done with the fuel, you put it in a fuel pool or into a dry casket and you sit it there on site. That is less safe than just taking it all in and sticking it in a mountain underneath Nevada. However, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission Chair Gregory Yachko, originally appointed by George W. Bush and elevated to chairman by Barack Obama, and he was a former senator to anti-Yucca Mountain Senator Harry Reid. He withheld information from his colleagues on the NRC. From the Wall Street Journal, the U.S.'s top nuclear power regulator strategically withheld information from his colleagues in an effort to stop work on a controversial proposed waste dump, according to a report by the agency's internal watchdog. This occurred, by the way, 4 months after Barack Obama took office. He had no intention on dealing with nuclear policy, not a priority, and he shut down Yucca Mountain because Harry Reid was in a tough battle in 2010, which he won narrowly against Sharon Engel. And then finally, I think this is finally for Barack Obama, on solar power. Obama says that he wants to promote green energy. Well, he has two very bad policies, if that's the case. One was playing venture capitalist with your money. Solyndra, which we all know went bust and lost $500 million, was a technology that actually might work. It's called CIGS, copper, indium, gallium selenide panels, diselenide panels. These are expensive panels, but they're more efficient than the cheap solar panels that we get from China. China uses amorphous silicon, which, think of like your calculators, those old calculators with the solar strips, that's amorphous silicon. So he decided, well, look, the price of silicon is probably going to go up as silicon becomes more and more and more in demand, so therefore we should invest in this new technology. Well, that's not what happened. The price of silicon came crashing down, and along with it, Solyndra's entire business model, and along with it, your $500 million. So that's bad decision number one. Subsidizing technology when you should be subsidizing basic research. I am completely in favor of subsidizing basic research. I think that's an appropriate role for government. But once a technology launches into the marketplace, that's when the federal government should back off and say, look, you have to make it on your own at this point. At some point, solar power is going to be the energy of the future. The technology is just not quite there yet, maybe 10, 20 years from now. So the Washington Post basically said, I'm not going to read this whole quote here, but the end of the line is that it gave an unprecedented glimpse, this whole Solyndra scandal gave an unprecedented glimpse into high-level maneuvering by politically connected clean technology investors. And that basically, if it's true that Bush, and I don't know, I'm not an expert on George W. Bush, but if it's true that he was, invested into big oil and all of his big oil buddies, it is equally true that Barack Obama brought in big solar as soon as he took office. His second bad policy, remember he says that it is a goal for us to advance solar power. So that makes a 31% tariff on Chinese solar panels a little bit head-scratching. Obviously, trying to save face a little bit in the face of Solyndra collapsing, so he wants to protect the American consumer. Unfortunately, when you slap a 31% tariff on cheap solar panels from China, you have the impact of not installing solar panels in this country. So he says that he wants to support solar panel technology and then slaps a tariff on China for doing that. And I wrote a piece in Forbes about this called "If You Can't Beat 'Em, Tax 'Em." So you decide, is President Obama pro-science? Or is he just another politician? Now the really fun stuff. You guys are isolated. I always think D.C. is kind of a reasonable city in a lot of ways because it's kind of, it's near Virginia. It's kind of in the South. A lot of, good hometown values. Come out to the left coast sometime. Come out to the west, and you'll see a whole different set of values. So I live in Seattle. I've been to Portland frequently, and I love San Francisco, and these are all great cities. Are they bastions of good science policy? Silliness in Seattle. What we called Snowmageddon. December of 2008, we had a big snowstorm. Heaven forbid you don't use salt in Seattle because that's bad for the environment. Particularly, they said it was bad for Puget Sound. If anyone knows anything about Puget Sound, it's a saltwater estuary. So adding a little bit of salt to a saltwater estuary, probably okay. The salmon will be all right. Instead, you take plows and you pack down the snow and sprinkle sand on top. Now, how many of you in here think that strategy worked? It did not. In fact, what we had ice potholes where you would be driving on top of this ice rink with sand on top, and potholes would form in the ice. So you would be going up and down. Like it was the worst thing I'd ever seen. And that's actually worse for the environment. Sand is one of the things you want to keep out of streams because sand will get into the gills of fish, and that actually hurts fish. So salt is a better choice for the environment than is sand. Well, that didn't work out well. Mayor Greg Nichols was bounced in the primary and was replaced by a guy who immediately fixed the problem by just cutting out road lanes and putting in bicycle lanes instead. So I guess that fixed it. We've also implemented a plastic bag ban that does absolutely nothing to help the environment. You'll see poor birds and turtles choking on plastic in the ocean. That's not usually due to plastic bags. That's usually due to fishing gear, to things that were left over, usually from fishermen. That is not usually due to Safeway plastic bags or whatever grocery store you guys have around here. Plastic bags are also energy efficient. If you want to use a cotton bag instead, you have to use it 173 times to even break even from an energy standpoint. Now, moving on to Portland. Portland's motto is keep Portland weird. That is not a problem. Water fluoridation is something that was invented in 1945, Grand Rapids, Michigan. It is seen as one of the best public health triumphs because people who cannot go to the dentist, people who are poor, can at least get some fluoride in their water, helps prevent cavities. It's a great thing. We see a drop in cavities when you fluoridate water. 200 million Americans get fluoridated water. Portland rejected this in 1980, and Oregon subsequently ranked near the bottom in children's dental health. Many Portlanders treasure their city's quirky distinctiveness, said the New York Times. And I agree, because being toothless is quirky and distinctive. And basically, I'm not going to read this quote from the New York Times, but basically, a couple weeks ago, City Council of Portland finally approved fluoridation to begin in 2014. Really a round of applause for Portland for joining the 20th century. I love Portland. If you're going to San Francisco, be sure to bring a plunger. Low-flow toilets, not San Francisco's fault, actually signed into law by President George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, which required low-flow toilets. Now, the impact of that is that sludge will back up in the city sewers, and the Mission Bay neighborhood, quote-unquote, smells like rotten eggs. They're using $14 million of taxpayer money to dump bleach into the sewer to clean up a problem that previously simply did not exist. Bleach isn't also a very friendly chemical, by the way. All right, so who can you trust in science? Well, I think that scientists, medical doctors, and yes, even government regulatory bodies like the FDA and EPA are usually right. Where I will nitpick with government regulators, I sometimes think they tend to be a little too cautious. For instance, we haven't gotten approval on e-cigarettes, and e-cigarettes should be healthier than regular cigarettes, and they're dragging their feet. On Real Clear Science, we try to link to the best science news, the best science analysis, and that's what we do. And so we try to put aside the partisan bickering and focus on what is good science and what is good science policy. So read major science journals, read the abstracts. Those are good things to look at. And look at, when you look at a position like GMOs, which side do you trust? The American Medical Association, the National Academy of Sciences, the World Health Organization, among many others, or do you trust PETA and the Sierra Club and the Environmental Working Group, groups that are, for the most part, anti-GMO and anti-technology. So always look at which groups side with the technology. The best medical doctors and scientists are siding with GMOs, on genetically modified foods. So my final thoughts. I'm not into keeping score, essentially. My book is not a response to Chris Mooney's book. It's simply saying, as Paul Harvey would say, what's the rest of the story? So we're just saying, look, yeah, the right gets some things wrong, but to pretend that the left is great on science isn't true. And that was the point of our book, revealing where the left goes wrong on science. Data is data. It doesn't have a political agenda. And we have to learn to distinguish science from policy. You know, when scientists dabble in public policy, they sometimes get into trouble. So you need to learn to distinguish what the science says from what a scientist speaking as a public policy advocate says. And if we can put aside our political differences, we should be able to agree on the lessons that science teaches us so you can handle the truth. Apologies to Colonel Jessup. And that's it. I'd like to thank AEI, Kenneth Green, John Entine, that's Dubs, our mascot at UW. John Entine and Kenneth Green have been instrumental in getting me here, so thank you very much. And just one final slide. In this book, we talked mostly about Barack Obama here. This book covers, that's just one chapter, okay? So you imagine how much information we've packed into this book. We talk about progressivism, the Obama administration, organic food, genetically modified food, the future of food, environmentalism, clean energy, solar power, vaccines, big pharma, animal research, European science, gender research, science journalism, false equivalence, war and excellence, and the important issues for 2012 and beyond. That's it. That's all I have. Thank you very much.
I'll say what Alex didn't buy their book. It's worth the investment and the read. Well, I have a bunch of questions, but I'm going to go to the floor after only asking one of them. Could you talk a little bit about how natural gas went from being clean burning natural gas, the darling of the environmental movement, to the point where we now have a war on natural gas from mainstream environmental movements?
Yeah, that's a great question, and John Entine has a great answer to this. So natural gas used to be a darling of the environmental left. They used to say, hey, this is a lot better than coal and oil. We should be burning this. In fact, you see buses driving around that are full of natural gas. That's because of them. Now, all of a sudden, natural gas is bad. Why? Well, in their vision, natural gas was simply a transitional fuel to wind power and solar power, which is that was a fine strategy. But what we have since discovered is that we are sitting on a veritable gold mine of natural gas. And because of that, they are now freaked out that their wind power, their solar power idea is going to be set aside in favor of natural gas. And so they are now demonizing fracking and natural gas because they want their wind power and solar power.
Very good. So we're going to go to the audience. We have microphones circulating. I will ask you, when you ask a question, when you're called on, to please state your name and affiliation. And remember the Jeopardy rule, and please ask your question in the form of a question. If you do not follow the Jeopardy rule, you will not advance to Double Jeopardy or Final Jeopardy in the question period. So we'll start right down here at the front.
Diane Silber, clinical psychologist. It's wonderful that you're encouraging facts should be agreed on by all sides. On the plastic bag question, though, what about that huge floating continent of plastic in the Pacific?
Yeah, so that's actually not a bunch of plastic bags. The Pacific, you're referring to the Pacific garbage patch. Yeah. It's more like microscopic and small particles of plastic. It's bad. Like, we don't want this there. That's a very bad thing. So people can pollute the planet. That becomes a problem with the food chain, with small organisms eating these plastic and then larger organisms eating that, and so it kind of bioaccumulates. Yes, that's a problem. But plastic bags from Safeway don't seem to be the big contributor to this problem.
I'm just finishing up an article on this because I've written about it myself before. It's not, the plastic patch is exaggerated in size. It's and what's actually in it, as Alex pointed out. The problem, though, is always that the left doesn't like to say, but compared to what? So plastic bags, you say, plastic bags are bad. But that organic cotton bag you got that was shipped by plane from Turkey isn't exactly good for the planet. And the fact that it carries and transmits disease from your vegetables to other foods, grows bacteria in the trunk of your car from leaking meat juices and the like. And recently, they implicated a cloth bag in infecting a women's soccer team, a girls' soccer team,
That's
with
true.
norovirus. So you know, it's not to say that plastic bags are great, but the alternatives, actually, in the study I looked at, there's a study done in the UK. It turned out they're better than virtually every other kind of bag on environmental grounds in terms of their performance, because they take so little. There's so little to them. There's very little energy in them. They're produced more locally and that kind of thing. They don't have to be washed.
That's an excellent point. One of the things that progressives seem to fail to grasp is that they'll rail against current technology. BPA's poison. Plastic bags are bad. Well, what would you replace it with? Is what your replacement, is that going to be safer? Is it going to be better for the environment? And they don't know, because everything in their eyes is an assault on the planet.
Down here, gentlemen, and then I'll come back there. I have seen you waving.
Hello, good afternoon. My name's Todd Wiggins. Quick question about Mr. Al Gore's campaign, having inconvenient truth and his involvement in science. Do you feel that his administration could have been more successful in some of the topics that you brought up? And how much of this is really an effective part of the re-election campaign in terms science right now? We don't hear as much of it in the debates. We haven't heard as much of it in debates. So do you think that's going to become more prominent in the vice presidential debates and then the subsequent, again, Romney versus Obama?
I don't think that science ever plays a large role in election outcomes. And for me, that's unfortunate. Do I think Al Gore would have been a better president? No. Someone who routinely exaggerates science offends me as a scientist, okay? Because that's not what scientists are supposed to do. His movie Inconvenient Truth regularly took information and would stretch it to the point of, well, okay, it's still scientifically somewhat accurate, but you're really stretching it here. And he did that over and over and over and over again. His 20-foot rise in sea level is assuming that the Greenland ice sheet melts, and no one knows if that's going to happen or not. There was actually a lot of melting this past summer. The Arctic actually didn't have much ice at all this past summer. So this is a problem, but it's not useful to exaggerate the problem, which is what he regularly did. And when you are caught exaggerating a problem, you lose credibility and the science loses credibility. So no, I don't think Al Gore would have been a better spokesman, because I don't think he did a good job at all in this field.
All right. After he invented the internet, I know he didn't say that. I actually was here in Washington in 1988, I think it was, and got to see a speech by Al Gore about developing the World Wide Web. So he actually does have, he's guided funding to a lot of it, but that's a different story. There's somebody over here who wanted in, and then I'll come over to this side of the room.
Hi, I'm Paul Rogerson, here from the Union of Concerned Scientists. And I first want to say thanks for the talk. I really enjoyed the remarks. My question is about the solution side. What can interested parties do to help combat or reduce the presence of misinformation about science in public debate, particularly when, as you suggest, it's often strongly connected to an overall worldview or cultural sensibility? How can you break through those things? Sometimes just getting good information out there doesn't seem to be enough.
So you said you're from the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Yes, I saw we were up there.
Yeah, the Union of Concerned Scientists is anti-genetically modified food, and they take a neutral stance on nuclear power, which to me is anti-nuclear power, because that's like saying, well, what's your feeling on bunny rabbits? Well, I'm neutral on bunny rabbits. You can't be neutral on bunny rabbits. So I think that the Union of Concerned Scientists has done a disservice by. I saw a couple of the reports that were issued, a failure to yield, which was about how genetically modified food does not increase crop yields. That's simply not true. Okay, the crop yields in the United States are a little bit higher, but we already have great technology. In the third world, in the developing world, GMOs are tremendously successful. They have increased crop yields 30, 40, 50%, and profits for farmers. They're willingly taking this technology. So I think a more balanced discussion is definitely needed on this. And we need to stop focusing just on the risks and focus also on the pros, because there's no such thing as a risk-free technology, okay? Cell phones cause risks, because when I'm talking on my cell phone, I usually don't look to see if the bus is going to hit me when I'm crossing the street, okay? Every technology carries a risk, but every technology also carries a pro. And a balanced discussion, a scientific discussion, balances the pros and cons and then makes a decision from there.
Very good. Wow, we have a forest of hands. The gentleman back here in the blue shirt. I try to give our microphone wielders exercise by sending them hither and thither.
Journalist. You have tried to portray this anti-GMO sentiment as a left-right issue. I've looked into this quite extensively, and all the polls show that this is evenly divided across the board. People are concerned about these GMOs, and they care about their health. And there was just a scientific study that came out of France, first long-term study of its kind, and you can disparage it. Okay, let's assume that it's not valid. Let's assume that there were not enough rats in the study, it was too small. If people are concerned about their food, why don't they have the right to see a label so that they can make a decision as to whether they want to eat that food? It's as simple as that.
So there's a lot to deal with there. Professor Seralini in France is an anti-GMO activist. He has a book coming out about why we should not have GMOs. He has a movie coming out about why we shouldn't be eating GMOs.
You can say Monsanto is a pro-GMO activist. What does that mean?
Okay, so let's dive into the details of the study. They used a strain of rat that was prone to getting cancer, and then they used very small samples. So you have a control group of 10 rats and another group of maybe 10 or 20 rats. Among rats which have a lifetime risk of getting cancer of around 50 to 70%. Okay, so when you design a study where your rats are going to massively get cancer, you need to have a study that looks at thousands of rats. Okay, that's one thing. The idea also that this was the first long-term study on GMO is not true. There have been other long-term studies of GMOs which said that they're perfectly fine. There have also been other long-term studies of looking at herbicides like glyphosate that said that was perfectly fine. So this is not the first time this has been looked at.
Let's assume the worst, and let's assume this study is not valid. But there is no scientific study here. GMOs were allowed into this country in the 90s without any vetting. There is no studying by the FDA.
I'm sorry. First, I want to call a halt to the person-to-person debate. We have other questions. There actually, if you look back at the beginnings of molecular biology, molecular genetics, in fact, as soon as they developed restriction enzymes, there was a moratorium on genetic engineering put into place simply out of precaution. And that was in the 1970s, 70s and early 80s. So it's not correct to say that no studies have been done of genetic modification. They have been all the way along. And the other thing is, I think what Alex is arguing is not that people can't have their opinion, but that the promotion of the anti-GMO agenda is much heavier on the left than on the right. Yeah. Individual people who are both right, left, and center will have their point of view. As for the labels, one last point, which is the labels can easily move from being informational to being scare labels. All you have to do is look at what's going on with cigarette packs to point that out and see the transition, which is first they put, and they also tend to be one-sided. So you'll have your label that says made with GMO wheat, right? You won't have, but the company won't be able to say improved nutrition because of GMO wheat. Right, so labeling is not as straightforward as you think it is when the government says you can label positively but not negatively or negatively but not positively, and it has to be this much of your label. It's very easy to get that agenda taken hold of by environmental groups or by activist groups with a purpose.
It's also worth pointing out that 75% of the food in the grocery store is genetically modified. Okay.
Wouldn't you agree that people should at least have the right to know what's in their food?
I'm telling you right now, most of your food is genetically modified.
But shouldn't we be able to
You ate it for lunch.
If we want to make a decision, shouldn't we be able to have a label just to see if we decide that this is not for us, we have a right
but it's a false label.
It's not a false label.
Yes,
let's move on, please. Gentleman right there in the front. Oh, over here?
My name is Peter Levin. I agree with most of your science, but I have a real problem how you choose to interpret some of this. I wrote the statement for Senator Connie Mack when he went to the floor to defend somatic cell nuclear transfer. It was after the whole Dolly business. And he was a conservative Republican in leadership. And we knew perfectly well we were going to have any problems with the Democrats on this. And the point of our going to the floor and doing this was really, as he said, you mean they want me to ban a technique? I can't ban a technique. And so the whole question of emphasis on what's happened, like who allowed more cell lines and all that, there was a political reality to this game. And we were doing it to give a bunch of Republicans cover to vote with us because we knew they would follow Mac. And on a number of things, you sort of slant things that I don't think are fair. I mean, the whole FDA, EPA thing, they let a drug through too fast and something happens, oh, the FDA is terrible. They take too long on a drug that would save lives, see, they're too slow. This goes on repeatedly on their bills. And I have a lot of trouble with if your conclusion is, I'm showing that Barack Obama is bad on science or not as good as George Bush, because I don't think you can draw it from what you've actually done here.
What question would you like to ask?
Well, the question is, I'd like you to say, I'm really more biased on this than I appear.
Well, I'm not going to say that because I think that the left and the right are both bad at science when it comes down to it. The point of our book was not to pick sides. I mean, we say this throughout the introduction. This is not the point of the book, to pick sides. The reason we wrote the book was to say when the left side of the political spectrum says we are pro-science, we're going to examine that claim. Okay, and that was the point of this, to examine that claim. Is the left pro-science? You're right. The right is bad at science too. I would certainly not disagree with that. Our point is that science should be nonpartisan and that politics should be taken out of the process as much as possible. I know it's not complete reality. You can't completely do it. But that was the point. I'm not trying to say Bush is better than Obama or Obama's better than Bush. That is not the point.
Alex, who gave us the cellulosic ethanol mandate?
Cellulosic ethanol. I'm going to guess, was that George Bush?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
George W. Bush.
Yeah.
We have a mandate for a fuel that nobody can manufacture, and now the EPA fines refiners for not buying a fuel that nobody can manufacture. This lady in the purple.
Hi, I really appreciate your efforts, and I'm with you on promoting team science. I'm Joan Stramanis. I'm a philosopher and historian of science and recently retired from the National Science Foundation. You haven't persuaded me not to worry about plastic residues in baby food and milk. You haven't persuaded me not to worry about pesticides, but I agree we should look at the data. I do want to ask, though, and seriously, with curiosity, not with an argument, about fracking. It seems to me that apart from the political motives, which we don't need to debate, isn't fracking a really bad use of water?
Well, it's one use of water. I mean, we use 49% of our nation's water supply is used for thermoelectric power plants. I mean, using water to generate electricity is a pretty regular use of water. In fact, half of our nation's water supply goes to doing that. As for, is it a good idea with pollution? Well, it depends on how it's set up. I mean, if what you're if the water table is here and where you're fracking is way down below that, which is oftentimes the case, the idea that you're going to pollute the groundwater is pretty minimal. And all of these processes are overseen by government regulators. They don't allow people just to go out and drill wells willy-nilly without any oversight. And this is a process that's been going on since the 1940s. It's only been recently in the news the last year, but we've been doing this for 70 years. This is not a new technology. We've just gotten better at it.
Also, I would add the point, which is that fracking is, while it's creating a huge revolution in gas production, It's not a new technology, and it is furthermore one that evolves over time. And so the recycling rate for water fracturing fluids has been escalating dramatically, and there are now people, companies actually looking at no water fracking, where they would basically use air and proppants instead of water. And so the companies already have a reason to recycle, which is to save bringing in new forms of water and save having to treat their water that they dispose of as a hazardous waste. So I think you're seeing, you can't point to it and say fracking is a bad use of water, because fracking, in a sense, doesn't exist. It's an evolving technology over time. And so you're going to see changes in the amount of water use very quickly. Gentleman back here in the red shirt.
Paul Turkeltaub, physician. The male to female ratio for autism is 5-to-1, yet there's no studies on autism and the risk of circumcision in circumcised males versus uncircumcised males. Chronic pelvic pain affects 9% of the adult male population. NIH did a study which showed that chronic pelvic pain is associated with increased lifetime prevalence of cardiovascular disease, neurologic disease, psychiatric conditions, erectile dysfunction. They collected circumcision data in that paper, but omitted that data from the publication. CDC called that publication bias. Is there some place where this correspondence can be published so people can review this and add to the question about circumcision, the long-term risk, because circumcision is being promoted universally for HIV/AIDS prevention. The AAP recently came out with circumcision.
I've never heard of a link between circumcision and autism. Is that
you have to look at it. It hasn't been looked at.
Okay.
You don't think it should be looked at? Is this ideology trumping science?
All I'm saying is I've never heard of that.
It hasn't been looked at.
One question, thanks.
Yeah, I've never heard of that, and if that's a legitimate biological mechanism,
what about the government suppression of data? If you haven't heard about it, if you haven't published the correspondence, I can provide you the correspondence. I can provide AEI the correspondence, and anybody can review it.
Can we move on, please, to the gentleman right there in the back, Nick Schultz? Wave your hand, Nick.
Hi, I'm Nick Schultz here at AEI. Thank you for a stimulating presentation. I have two questions for you, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure.
The first is, if you could talk about, we're talking about, to some extent, the politicization of science, most of which happens in sort of public policy, political discussions. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the politicization of science in academia, and if there has been, say, a slight, I don't want to, and for lack of a better word, say corruption of some scientific disciplines because of the interaction with politics. I haven't in mind climate science, but I think there could be other examples, maybe GMOs.
I actually just wrote. I would have it hard to believe that it's in GMOs because of the biological, the chemical, and the physical sciences are about as far removed from political ideology as you can possibly imagine. You know, my daily routine at the lab was to grow bacteria and then do very bizarre things to them and then get results from that, okay? My political philosophy played no role in what I did on a daily basis. So I would say that on biology, chemistry, physics, geology, astronomy, politics probably plays very little role. On the social sciences, yes, I think that you will. It is hard to imagine when a field like sociology is 30-1 Democrat to Republican that doesn't affect the quality of the research that comes out of the field. Yeah, and economics, by the way, which is considered the conservative social science, Democrats outnumber Republicans 3-1. So it's hard to imagine that political ideology doesn't play a role in the social sciences.
But I would amend that to differ a little bit. There does seem to be a problem when there's a high profit potential for research products, leading to high levels of retractions and fraud. That's becoming more and more better understood as there was a recent study that looked at why papers are retracted, and I believe they found 75% of them were actually intentional fraud rather than
the overall retraction rate they looked at, they found 2,500, approximately 2,500. That was out of 25 million. So the retraction rate is like 0.01%. It's extremely low.
Gentleman in the center here.
Hi, my name's is this on?
Yeah.
My name's Jeff Schrade. I work for the natural gas industry. So I'd just like to address the water issue and then a quick question. When we frack a well, it uses about the same amount of water as used on a golf course in about 3 weeks. So, and with that energy, we're producing a lot more natural gas that's creating a tremendous amount of jobs in this country and bringing manufacturing back. So it's kind of, it goes back to what you were talking about, the trade-off. It's not either or, it's here are all the other factors. I did have a question. You mentioned on corn ethanol that it creates nitrous oxide. Are other ethanols created from other products? Do they also create nitrous oxide?
I don't know about that. I do know that there are other biofuels which have promise. And one of them, ironically enough, is a genetically modified algae, which is able to take carbon dioxide and convert it into long-chain fatty acids, which is diesel, biodiesel. So there are other, so definitely don't lump all biofuels together because they're not all the same. Converting corn to ethanol seems to be a particularly bad idea, but there are other types of biofuels which may have potential.
And from my perspective, the nitrous oxide is the least of the problems. When you look at the nutrient loading causing dead zones in the oceanic dead zones, pesticide loading and nutrient loading in waterways in corn growing area, and massive, really massive amounts of water consumption.
And skyrocketing food prices.
And skyrocketing food prices as well. When the riots happen from food, it's not very good for the environment either. Next. Actually, there's one question I wanted to ask about real quick. The Deepwater Horizon situation. You mentioned that they withheld information about what was likely to happen. We wrote about that as well. Again, being biologists, we know that the ocean is actually quite resilient to things like oil spills and the like. But could you talk a little bit, or do you know about the review panel recommendations with regard to the moratorium?
No, I'm not familiar with that. Have you looked into that at all?
No, it's. I just wanted to know if you were up on it, because I think people would find it illuminating to realize that. Basically, when they convened a review panel on whether or not they should have a moratorium, the panel said no. The Obama administration, rewrote the recommendations, and later all of the people on the panel came out. Virtually all of them came out and said, "We said no, not yes." So, all right. Well, let's go to here then.
You talked about the politicization of science and criticized overregulation at the FDA. Well, in the case of GMOs, there is no regulation. There's a blank slate.
Ask questions, please. I don't want to have a debate between one person in the audience and our
What would you
guest.
suggest, that if there is no regulation, what would you suggest to allay fears about GMOs? What kind of regulations, other than having Monsanto itself do the regulations and refusing to allow independent researchers to test their patented seeds?
Thank you.
What would you,
Okay.
what would you suggest?
What policy response would you like to
So
ask?
the FDA's current policy, I think that it is true that the biotech company usually does their own testing. Is that is my understanding of it. Do you have any more insight on that?
Well, the biotech companies do their own testing because they have liability to worry about.
Right.
And also they are required to have approvals, regulatory approvals, before they can commercialize their crops. So the research is done by the private sector, but of course that's what you want, is because they actually know the technology better. You wouldn't want the testing to be done by somebody who doesn't understand the actual technology used to make the genetically engineered product.
There's also something else that when you say there is no regulation, that's not true. The FDA has a policy, and the policy is known as substantial equivalence. What they essentially ask is, if you have a genetically modified crop and you have a conventional crop, does the genetically modified crop match the original crop nutritionally? Okay, that's essentially the question. Does it have the same nutrients? Are there toxins in it? Is there something that's bad about it?
The FDA has not determined that. Monsanto determines that. It's
Well, I mean,
Monsanto's decision.
if you would like to have an independent review board do that, then maybe that's a reasonable reform. But here's what the FDA's policy is. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to explain to you what the policy is. You say they don't have a policy. They do have a policy, and it's a policy called substantial equivalence. Now, what they will then do, if the FDA determines that a food does not meet substantial equivalence, then it is subject to full FDA approval. And not only does the FDA have a say in it, if you want to go out and plant it outside, the USDA and the EPA also get involved. involved.
But how can you expect to get a fair hearing when Michael
Sir-
Taylor, the former
Sir, you're pretty much
former
blowing
vice
the
president
rules of
Monsanto,
engagement here
is in
completely out
charge
the window.
in charge of labeling at the FDA. He's a former Monsanto guy.
Sir, you
Vice
might actually
president.
make me cut off the mic for the first time in 6 years I've been here.
Okay, may I ask the question?
You're done with your questions. You've had 5 or 6 or 7 of them.
But you haven't answered them.
Take the mic from him, please. Can we have an actual question then, in the form of a question? This lady here. I think it's on. It's just
It is?
quiet.
Okay. So kind of going back to what Paul asked earlier, we can talk a lot about all of the problems and who's the worst and which side is doing which thing, but what do you recommend in terms of solutions, either from the scientific community or from politicians or even the general public?
Well, that's the $64,000 question, and to address your first question, we can determine which side is worse. That's not the game I like to play. Okay, I'm not interested in point scoring and saying, oh look, the Republicans get a -10 and the Democrats get a -15. I'm not interested in that. I don't care. My goal as a scientist and now as a science writer is to straighten the public record and to say the conservatives get this wrong on evolution, on climate change. They're wrong here. The liberals or the progressives are wrong on genetic modification. That's the role that I see myself playing, and that's the role we play on Real Clear Science. As for how do you improve communication, I mean, that's the $64,000 question. You know, scientists don't have a strong lobbying group in Washington. I mean, there are a very small handful of science lobbying groups, and scientists don't tend to go out and vote en masse. You know, when they're upset about something, you don't see a bunch of white lab coat people protesting. You know, it just doesn't happen.
And I feel like that's been intentional in a lot of ways, and that scientists have tried to stay out of this debate so as not to appear biased. Or
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier someone whose study you questioned because they were an activist. So how do we,
Yeah.
I am a scientist, how do we communicate without appearing to be biased?
It is the most delicate tightrope walk you can imagine. It is giving the science, and then if you feel compelled to say what policy you think they should follow, saying, now I'm speaking as a policy advocate, and I think we should do this policy, okay? Because that is a different discussion than the underlying science, and I think making that distinction crystal clear is important for scientists to do.
I have a real quick question, Alex. What do you think about the argument that some make that science journalism shouldn't carry both sides of every issue, that there are some issues that are simply so overwhelmingly consensus-oriented that you simply shouldn't cover both sides? As a science journalist, what do you think of that?
I think that that's been a big problem, and that's partially why for so long people believe that vaccines cause autism, because the medical community, and I'm being quite serious when I say the medical community never even believed this. Okay, I've taught classes where I would bring up, I say, okay, well, there are some concerns here with this, and a professor in the back of the room said, no, there are not. There are no concerns about this, okay? It is just not accepted in the medical community. So part of the problem was that science journalists weren't the ones that were doing most of that reporting. It was general reporters. And so what do general reporters do? They go get an opinion from a Democrat, they go to get an opinion from a Republican, and that's the news for the day. That doesn't work in science. You can't get, well, here's the pro-vaccine position, and now we're going to go find an anti-vaccine kook and see what they say, and that's now a balanced position. It doesn't work like that in science. And to do better science journalism, it helps to have scientifically knowledgeable people as science journalists, people who were former scientists.
In fact, that's one of the problems with the imploding media, I think, is that the people who are actually science writers are being let go, and the science beat is going back to general reporters.
I believe it was Ben Goldaker from Guardian who said that the decline of science journalism is its own fault, and that when scientists who become bloggers can do a better job at science communication than science journalists, then that's a really bad thing for science journalism. I mean, it's good for the public, but for the established media, it's not good for them.
Anyone who hasn't asked a question yet? Down here.
Thanks very much for this excellent presentation. It was very interesting. I'm Adam Kuiper from the New Atlantis.
We've run some of your stuff on Real Clear Science.
I know, it's wonderful. Thank you so much. So one minor quibble with your presentation, and then a question. So the quibble is, you mentioned in passing that human cloning is banned in the United States. That, to my knowledge, is just not true. Federal funding is prohibited from going to human cloning in the same way that they're under the Dickie Wicker rider. There are other prohibitions.
You may be correct on that. My knowledge is that cloning for the purpose of creating a new human being is illegal. That was my understanding of it.
Nope.
Am I not right about that?
I'm happy to chat some more afterwards.
Yeah,
but
I'm not sure on that one. I think there is a de facto moratorium, I think, on it, and it's been condemned, but I don't think it's been banned.
There's no
Okay.
law against
But
it.
thank you for correcting me then.
So that's just a correction. So on to linger for a little more on the bioethics side now. One of my problems with the kind of pro-science, anti-science rubric that a few other people here have quibbled with, comes from looking at what the policies are that are described as being pro-science or anti-science. So you presented President Obama's stem cell policy and gave a kind of summary of President Bush's stem cell policy, which, as you rightly noted, was derided at the time by critics, including many scientist activists. I mean, scientists really did get very involved in politics from 2001 on through maybe 2007-8 on this issue. It was derided as being anti-science, and yet the policy was put in place to institute a kind of ethical boundary, to say here are some things that we don't want to permit, here are some things that we would like instead to encourage, other avenues. Just this week, the Nobel Committee of the Nobel Assembly announced that a researcher named Yamanaka, who discovered induced pluripotent stem cells.
And Gordon. Yamanaka and Gordon.
But in particular, Yamanaka. Gordon had done cloning work with frogs decades ago.
Yep.
But Yamanaka, the discoverer of induced pluripotent stem cells, a kind of stem cell that prevents the need to destroy human embryos and create embryonic stem cells. He would be sharing the Nobel Prize this year. So, coming around to the question, I mean, here's a policy, President Bush's policy, that was put in place to stop incentivizing and stop the funding of, prevent the funding of the destruction of human embryos for the name of research, the creation and destruction of human embryos for research purposes. And it ended up kind of encouraging other avenues of scientific research that just this week we've learned have resulted in a Nobel Prize. So now, finally, after this long-winded come around, here's the question. I mean, I think this is a challenge to the anti-science and pro-science rubric, and I wonder if you'd say that, in fact, it can withstand this sort of thing as we look at it over time, whether it's like a little bit of a too shallow way of looking at things, whether it's coming from Chris Mooney on the left or from the approach that you've got here, that things are more complicated than pro-science or anti-science would imply.
You're absolutely correct that there is a role for bioethics in science, okay? And I would be hesitant to call someone anti-science if they are objecting on something on bioethical grounds. You can actually get a PhD now in bioethics. Okay, so that's how involved and complicated this field has become. So I would agree with you that there is a value in not just plowing forward and doing whatever we want whenever we want. There was a quote from Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park who said that we were so obsessed to see whether or not we could do something, we never actually stopped to think if we should. Okay, and heaven forbid that I get my philosophy from Jurassic Park, but actually he makes actually a decent point, right? So that is a key role in bioethics. Now I come down the side that embryonic stem cells is something that we should be doing, including induced pluripotent stem cells. Now you said that those have proven that we don't need embryonic stem cells. That's not true. So induced pluripotent stem cells, I actually saw a study a couple years ago where they compared the transcription profiles. The transcription profile has to do with the mRNA expression from a cell. And they showed that induced pluripotent stem cells and embryonic stem cells simply are not the same. And we would never have known that had we not studied embryonic stem cells. I do think that they have a tremendous promise, but I think we have to go side by side in doing both at the same time.
And just to clarify, I didn't actually say that embryonic stem cell research should not at all be funded, nor
Sure.
that induced pluripotent
Sure.
stem cells.
Fair enough.
will probably be our last question.
Alex, one question I didn't get a chance. I wanted to ask you about how you felt about NASA space exploration, the International Space Station, and the recent expedition and landing Curiosity on Mars. How does that play into some of the ideas that you have, if at all? And what are you looking forward to seeing in the next couple of years that you think could be beneficial to not only the country but the world?
Boy, that's a great question. And I think that space policy, I think NASA turning over some of the more routine, taking cargo up and taking cargo back, we call that routine, but it's actually very dangerous. I think turning that over to the private sector was a good move. I think it allows us to focus more on really big projects that the private sector may not be able to fund. Because I can't conceive of a private company going to Mars. Just because what's the financial payoff? You get to Mars and then what? It's big red dirt planet. There's not a lot there. So I see the role of NASA taking more of a broad, put a moon colony on the moon. That'd be kind of cool. Go to Mars, do things like that. If we have the money for it, I would like to see that. And then the private sector doing more of the space tourism and then some of the more routine cargo shuttling, things like that. I think that's a good direction seems to be that's what we're heading in.
Is there funding for that?
I don't know.
If you look at what's happening right now, we just had a private launch to the space station, a second private launch to the space station. So clearly there is money. It's detailed through NASA at this point still, but there's funding for it. I'm very optimistic. You have multiple companies now competing on spaceflight designs, and I think that's why a private company will go to Mars. Is bragging rights over the technology and the value of the patents and technologies they'll spin off from the development.
There was an idea that the government would give an award to the first team who gets there, and they say, hey, the first team that gets to Mars gets $20 billion or something, and that might be a motivating factor to get to Mars. I'm kind of open-minded. I haven't been married to any particular idea on space policy. It's evolving. We're watching it evolve before our very eyes, and it's going to be interesting to see where it goes for the next few years.
I do have a position on Mars. I'd rather see us explore the ocean bottoms first, because we haven't even mapped them as well as we've already mapped Mars. And on that note, I will wrap us up. Thank you all for your attendance, and I hope have you a great afternoon.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, so circumcision causes autism, then all the Jews should be autistic.
Now, you could have said that.
Circumcision causes autism, and it causes infertility, and it causes back problems, which is why Jews are known as being autistic.